that loneliness is the worst of all human sufferings. But not only that, it is the greatest crisis that is facing us today. Regardless of age, each of us has dealt with the reality of loneliness somehow. Whether it be a child struggling to make friends at school, the quarter-life crisis that happens after graduating from college, or the feeling of being disconnected from one's spouse in the midst of being overwhelmed with family life. Or you could just be a seminarian. I want to elaborate further. No matter what, loneliness seems to be present in every phase of life. Therefore, it seems to me that it is of utmost importance that we not only understand the severity of loneliness and the destruction that it can have in our own lives, but also discover that there is indeed a hope. To accomplish this, I hope to address loneliness by answering 3 questions. First, what do I mean by loneliness? Second, why is loneliness the worst human suffering? And third, does there even exist a cure? And if so, where should we look for it? So what do I mean by loneliness? I'm not referring to fleeting moments of solitude or occasional disconnection. I'm speaking of something deeper and far darker. I mean the kind of loneliness where despair settles in as a permanent state, where a person believes life has taken a turn from which there is no recovery, and that they're not simply alone, they're absolutely hopeless. They believe that nothing will ever get better, that no one is coming for them, that they have been absolutely forgotten and abandoned. So why is this kind of loneliness the worst suffering that we can experience in our lives? I argue it is because of 3 consequences: the metaphysical and the 2 that flow from it, the psychological and the sociological. When viewed together, these 3 consequences paint such a powerful picture of loneliness that no other suffering can compare with it. So first, the metaphysical consequence. Loneliness constitutes the worst suffering because it is the direct privation of our deepest natural desire for intimate relationships that result in communion with both God and others. No other kind of suffering can result in such a privation that results in someone wholeheartedly believing that God and all other persons have forgotten and abandoned them. Loneliness therefore cuts the depths of our existence and destroys both the meaning of our life and any resemblance of hope whatsoever. Second, the psychological consequence. Prolonged loneliness results in, at its worst, severe clinical anxiety that inevitably leads to major depressive disorder, severe depression. Symptoms would include extreme, agonizing, and crippling sorrow, suicidal thoughts, and a completely non-existent self-esteem. And from these symptoms, loneliness is not only the privation of man's final end in a merely abstract way, but it is also a suffering that personally extends into the whole of his life. It affects his physical and his mental health. And lastly, there is the sociological consequence. And when we look at society as a whole, it is very clear that we are living in an epidemic of loneliness. This is seen most clearly in my generation, Gen Z, who are beginning to graduate from college and are preparing to enter adult life. 3 troubling studies about Gen Z confirm the following. The first study shows that rates of depression and anxiety among Gen Zers, regardless of mere symptoms or actual clinical diagnoses, have skyrocketed since the year 2011, showing around an average 5% increase. The second study says that the suicide rate is dramatically rising among teens and young adults. 46% more 14 to 19-year-olds committed suicide in 2015 as compared to 2007, and 2.5 more times 12 to 14-year-olds opted for suicide. The third study shows that they have decided to forgo any religious affiliation. More and more of our young people are abandoning God and have stopped going to church, thereby removing any strong likelihood of the development of intimate relationships rooted in truth and goodness. Additionally, all of these statistics I am sharing with you are even more cause for concern when we recognize that these numbers represent not merely a few hundred individuals, but are intended to represent millions of teenagers and young adults. All of this data points to the sad, unfortunate reality that loneliness has become the new normal. emphasizing all three aspects into one, loneliness must be considered the worst of all sufferings, because there currently exists an epidemic in society of a pain that is the direct privation of man's innate desire for communion. This results in the destruction of man's purpose and a disastrous disarray of both his body and soul. So, from this terrible situation I have just described, does there exist any hope? Is there a cure for loneliness? And although there are many proposed remedies for loneliness, there are two in complete opposition that I would like to put in dialogue with one another. Those two people are Friedrich Nietzsche and Jesus Christ. Starting with Nietzsche, he argues that the person suffering from loneliness should become what he terms the Übermensch, which in German means the man who stands above others. Well, the question anyone would ask is, how does one become this Übermensch? And for Nietzsche, the goal is to overcome one's weakness and to strive to attain four things: pleasure, honor, glory, and power. And it is our entire life's purpose to attain these four things, even at the expense of others. And when we do this, we begin to feel alive, because we have an enthusiasm for life, and you become a powerful and capable person. You believe that you are far better than everyone else, because people honor you, they recognize how great you are. So think of a CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, or a professional MMA fighter who went undefeated in his career. Both of these kinds of people exist at the top of the hierarchy. This kind of person for Nietzsche is what the lonely person most deeply wants when he is suffering from his isolation. The end result for Nietzsche, then, is that one moves from a state of loneliness to a state of aloneness. Now, the question you might be asking yourself is, does becoming this Übermensch, as Nietzsche proposes, does it really constitute an authentic cure for loneliness? And unfortunately, the answer is no for two reasons. The first is that Nietzsche's aloneness is still the deepest privation of man's nature. Nietzsche's cause to aloneness does not change the simple fact that man's nature innately desires communion with other persons. Changing one's perception of being isolated makes absolutely no difference whether one is lonely or alone. In either case, both are ontologically the same in that there is no other person with which to share one's life. This leads to the second reason, namely, that the Übermensch is isolated because he has no friends. No one would want to be friends with someone who is a self-centered, egotistical narcissist who habitually fails to see beyond himself. But this is exactly who the Übermensch is. Consequently, what Nietzsche actually proposes, instead of an authentic remedy, is merely the call for a person to ignore his natural desire for friendship and communion, create a delusional narrative about the meaning of life, and treat all persons as opportunities to attain pleasure, power, honor, and glory, so that he can feel content in being alone. Such a proposal cannot even be considered a remedy. On the contrary, Nietzsche's remedy is an insidious poison, disguised as a painkiller that becomes increasingly addictive the more one pursues it. In the end, Nietzsche ultimately fails to provide a cure for loneliness. So if the Nietzschean remedy of the Übermensch and his aloneness is a false one, then does there exist any other hope for us? Fortunately, there is. The true remedy for loneliness is to be found in our friendship with Christ. Our friendship with Jesus constitutes a cure for loneliness for two reasons. The first reason is that Jesus reveals to the lonely that he himself suffered from loneliness. Scripture attests to Christ's loneliness when it writes in the book of Psalms, "My heart arrayed reproach and misery, and I hoped for one that would grieve together with me, but there was none. I looked for one who would comfort me, and found no one. For food they gave me gall, and in my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink." This, of course, is referring to Christ on the cross. And on the cross he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He identifies himself among the lonely and communicates through his suffering of loneliness words which the lonely person wants to hear. I understand your loneliness because I have suffered as you have suffered. But also, in addition to understanding, he also shows us how to act in the midst of our loneliness through his kenosis and the complete gift of himself, which is the second reason. The word kenosis, which means the act of emptying in Greek, refers to when Christ emptied himself and took the form of a slave. We are talking about his incarnation, where in becoming man, he can now understand us not only as the Creator, but as an intimate friend, also as an intimate friend. This intimate relationship is made possible through his sacred humanity. His kenosis allows him to provide the response to loneliness. Instead of grasping in desperation, as Nietzsche proposes, Jesus reveals, in opposition to the Nietzschean proposal, that the complete gift of self is the true cure for loneliness, because he became man so that he could give himself completely in an unconditional love for us. He shows his unconditional love above all on the cross. It is precisely why he is hanging from the cross with his arms outstretched, that he can say to the lonely person, "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." Despite being abandoned and betrayed by his closest friends, Jesus responds not in desperately grasping for control of the situation, but in a peaceful, self-emptying, perfect love that extends to the whole of humanity, especially the lonely. We too, as Catholics, are called to this kenosis and gift of self. And I would like to share two particular ways that we can imitate Christ's response. The first way is that we must carry our cross in the certain hope that Jesus remains with us always, even when our loneliness is at its worst. Christ reminds us that he is always with us when he says, "And remember, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." The second way is that we must learn to offer ourselves completely to the people we love by truly listening to them, to be receptive. The Catholic spiritual author Henry Nouwen writes, "When we honestly ask ourselves which persons in our lives mean the most to us, we often find it as those who, instead of giving much advice, solutions, or cures, have chosen rather to share our pain and touch our wounds with a gentle and tender hand. The friend who can be silent with us in a moment of despair and confusion, who can stay with us in an hour of grief and bereavement, who can tolerate not knowing, not curing, not healing, and face with us the reality of our powerlessness. That is the friend who cares." And so Jesus, in the same way, patiently loved us by extending his hand to us in the darkest moments of our lives. We, in turn, as a response, are called to bring him to others. The next thing I want to explain is how exactly does this friendship of Christ, in imitating him in his kenosis and gift of self, how does it constitute the authentic cure of loneliness? It is an authentic cure because it reverses the three consequences of loneliness that I mentioned earlier. For the metaphysical consequence, the Christian fulfills his deepest innate desire for intimacy and communion with both God and others through his friendship with Christ. Second, the joy and consolation that necessarily flow from his intimate friendship eventually heal him of the psychological pain due to his loneliness. In other words, he is free from depression. He is healed from it in the experience of loving and affirming friendships. And lastly, the sociological consequence, the epidemic of loneliness, is gradually reversed in the Christian seeking out those who are suffering as Christ did. In doing so, he directly fights against the epidemic of loneliness that is ravaging society today. Christ came to bring healing to the broken. And in the same way, the Christian is to bring healing through sharing the love that he has received, principally in the virtue of lovingly and patiently listening to others. Our friendship with Christ, therefore, restores and heals the metaphysical, sociological, and psychological consequences of loneliness. I'll conclude with this remark. Every lonely person is presented with a choice between the Nietzschean delusion and the authentic cure that comes from friendship with Christ. If we choose Nietzsche, we will sadly find ourselves enslaved in a narcissistic personality and perpetual isolation from others. But if we choose Christ, if we respond to his grace, we open ourselves to the God-man who revealed the deepest understanding of our pain. As Christ himself carried that pain to the summit of Calvary, simply because of his immense and unconditional love for us. Consequently, a new horizon of life opens to us, where we seek to imitate the example of our dearest friend Jesus. And although we may struggle and fail an endless amount of times to follow his example, it is in the faithful persistence that we not only find healing for our own loneliness, but also bring healing to others. The horror of loneliness, that which is man's worst suffering, can only be remedied by our friendship with Christ and living to invite others to that same friendship in the imitation of his self-emptying love